What happens when your worst fear becomes your reality? Hi, I'm Brent Cassity. Welcome to the Nightmare Success In-N-Out podcast, where we explore how to overcome your fears and nightmares and set yourself free. We're going to be exploring this topic with guys I was in Leavenworth with and others who survived their own nightmare. These stories can be inspiring, sometimes sad. There's some humor, but hopefully you can come away with a nugget of something that'll help you knock down some of the prisons you built up in your own mind. All right, everybody. We're back. Welcome back. Nightmare Success In-N-Out. I've really been looking forward to this interview because, this show is all about what happens when your worst fear becomes your reality. Well, Bill Baroni, if anybody follows politics, there was an event that happened. And if you have a gate put on the back of your anything in politics, that means it was something big. Well, it was Bridgegate. If anybody was following the board game at home, it was Governor Chris Christie. It had to do with the George Washington Bridge and lane closures. And there were a couple of people that got convicted. And it was a whole fiasco saga. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ended up throwing out the convictions. And my guest, Bill Baroni, was in all of that. And just give you a little bit of background about Bill, because he's just lived a journey of a life. But he's been in politics. He was elected to the legislature in New Jersey, General Assembly, New Jersey State Senate. As I said, Governor Chris Christie appointed him to the New York, New Jersey Port Authority, the largest transportation agency in the country, overseeing bridges, tunnels, rails, the World Trade Center and buses, the port. And he's been a member of numerous boards, too many to list, a Seton Hall law professor. He's the co-founder of Prison Visitation Fund, and he's a leader in the area of health and fighting obesity. He actually wrote a book, The Fat Kid Got Fit. Look that up on Amazon. But ultimately what happened with Bill was he went through this whole fiasco. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison with the whole, and we'll go through this and talk about it. And as things happened, he became a big advocate for the justice impacted community. Once he got through that, he's still teaching law professor at Seton Hall and prison law. And what a voice for that. And I can't wait to unpack all that. Before we do, I want to recognize our show sponsor, who likes spending a couple of weekends walking car lots looking for a car. I don't know too many that like to do that. Then you spend 4 or 5 hours at the dealership to buy a car. It's kind of like a root canal appointment. Well, there's a better way to take away all that pain and hassle of getting a car. It's called Auto Plaza Direct. They are your personal car concierge. Just tell them the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. Negotiate your best price, and they'll also offer you warranties and financing. It's all full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com to get started with your personal car concierge, the new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Auto Plaza Direct. Tell them Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. Okay, folks, we're here. Bill, welcome.
Thanks, Brent. Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm glad we were able to make it work. And I have really been excited to talk to you because I think your experience is unique, because you were on one side of the world and then you came to the other side of the world. And then because you have a great brain, you're now using that great brain for things that I'm so interested in. And that's the justice impacted community. And what you're doing there is great work, and teaching young people in the law community about, this side of the world, what happens when your worst fear becomes your reality, and how do you adjust and survive and overcome. Take us back a little bit, Bill, because I know what brought you to where you were, but growing up as a kid and all that, what was your world like?
I grew up in Hamilton, New Jersey, a great town in central New Jersey. It's still home for me. And, I got involved in politics when I was a kid. My mother was a Irish Catholic Kennedy Democrat. My father's a Republican. And so I came from a mixed marriage. And I remember when I was a kid, my parents would pack my sister and I in the car and drive us over to the polling place and cancel each other's votes out.
That's
But
funny.
when I was 14 years old, I volunteered for my local congressman, who is still a congressman from New Jersey, Chris Smith. He was one of those politicians that both mom and dad liked. And I worked for his campaign, worked in his office, and just started working in politics. And went on to Washington, D.C. for undergrad at George Washington University. Came back to New Jersey, had one of the great jobs in politics as a driver. I was the driver for the Speaker of the State Assembly, a wonderful guy named Chuck Hytian, and
Wow.
drove all across the state of New Jersey. I did 120,000 miles in 10 months. You can still drop me anywhere in New Jersey, and I can find a diner and a donut shop in
I
5 minutes.
bet you can.
And then went on to law school at the University of Virginia, maybe my 3 favorite years in life, and became a lawyer and moved back home to Hamilton and got involved, continued to be involved in politics. In those intervening years, I worked as a staff person for Senator McCain and others. And so I came back home and eventually ran for and was elected to the state assembly from a very Democratic district, beat an incumbent. 4 years later, went to the state Senate. And as you were kind to say, about halfway through my term in the state Senate, and I was always a very independent legislator. I was always a legislator who sort of voted my constituency. I had a very Democratic district, and I was able to get elected, reelected, really working hard for my constituents. But I also had a voting record that was very much in the middle. I was cast the deciding vote for medical marijuana for sick people. And I cast a vote for raising the minimum wage, always stood with working people and people who were in organized labor. Cast the first ever vote in the New Jersey legislature for marriage equality, an issue I care passionately about. Sat on the Judiciary Committee and had some introduction to criminal justice issues on the other side.
Right.
But then Governor Christie asked me to go to the Port Authority, especially to help jumpstart the seemingly frozen building of the World Trade Center. When I remember the night before I started at the Port Authority, the night before, 60 Minutes did a story about the World Trade Center being one big hole in the ground. And I was determined to work with others, both in New York and New Jersey, to change that. Now, across the street from where I'm sitting right now in Lower Manhattan is the World Trade Center. And, that's something I was very proud of. And of course, the Port Authority.
I've got to ask you though, Bill, because that's such most people, everybody knows about that because when the World Trade Centers crashed and crumbled, there was a lot of talk about that. And I don't think, that is such a big part of commerce and things that happen in the United States. When you took that over, I mean, what was going through your mind that this is, because you did a lot of work in that. I mean, you did some stuff with the port where people could bring in more, they raised the bridge. I mean, you did a lot of things that, I would think would be hard to get done in that environment because you are dealing with both sides and things move like molasses. But what were your thoughts when you got appointed into that position?
Well, I always joke that like going to the Port Authority in the role that I had is like drinking from a fire hose, but eventually you just get used to being wet. And, you just, every minute, it was a great job. It is a great organization, some great people I got to work with. Regardless of how it all ended for me, some extraordinary, dedicated public officials who did some amazing things, like raise the Bayonne Bridge and build the World Trade Center and work on the airports and work at the port itself. And it was a great organization, did some great work. But for me, I mean, it was a mission, right? It was a mission to get the World Trade Center rebuilt and opened, and we did it. The first was to open the memorial itself, the pools, for the 10th anniversary. We made it by about 2 weeks, and that was working around the clock 7 days a week. It's not something I ever imagined in my career. But one of the things I think that all of your listeners and you and I have both experienced is you can't actually plan it all out. Like when I went to the Port Authority in, whatever it was, March of 2010, I never imagined I didn't end up in federal prison.
Right.
But like that's, what the story is about, overcoming adversity.
Right.
And so I went to the Port Authority and took that role and had an extraordinary experience there and did some great things working with people who really committed. People, not only is the Port Authority often divided geographically, New York and New Jersey, but it's also sometimes divided partisanly, Republican and Democrat. I just had the experience as an elected official of working across the aisle, So when I got to the Port Authority, I was used to working with people of different political party, different ideological
Yeah, it would have
backgrounds.
been a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, I had the opportunity, and with a guy named Pat Foy, who was the appointee of Governor Cuomo, then Governor Cuomo, to the Port Authority. So, so interestingly enough, so Pat sort of came out of somewhat of a Republican tradition, but was appointed by a Democratic governor. I came out of a very moderate position, appointed by a Republican governor. But as I like, Pat and I, and Pat and I didn't always get along from a policy perspective. From a personal perspective, we used to joke we're two Irish guys, and we can work it out. And I have a great deal of respect for Pat.
Well, as a fellow Irishman, I noticed that you are also a citizen of Ireland. Is that correct?
I am. It's a very complicated story that I'm very proud of. That, in December of 1971, I was born in Jacksonville, Florida. Spent 6 great weeks there. I was my birth mom was an Irish woman who came over to Jacksonville, Florida, to give birth to me. An incredible sacrifice by an incredible woman, real courage, real dedication to me, and allowed me to be raised by 2 amazing parents in Hamilton, New Jersey, who came down 6 weeks after I was born and came and adopted me. And I grew up in central New Jersey, but mom and dad who raised me, mom was first generation Irish. Dad is 3/4 Irish. So it was through my mom, Geraldine, who raised me, that I got my Irish citizenship. But I always used to say I was an Irish guy with an Italian name. For New Jersey politics, that's a perfect combination.
Perfect. Exactly.
So I spent a lot of time in Ireland, to the great credit of the prosecutors in my case and Judge Wigginton, who oversaw my case. That during the years throughout the investigation and the indictment and the trial, they never objected to allowing me to go home to Ireland. And so I still spend a lot of time there at home in Dublin.
So you have a relationship with your birth mom.
Well, I was just telling a story about how I was adopted, but I have met a number of through DNA, met a number of my Irish family. But it's interesting because even I remember when Bridgegate all first blew up, I went home to Ireland. I mean, within days. Of course, I never imagined where it would go. I just thought it was a big political issue. Never imagined the criminal justice issue, and most certainly never imagined in December of 2013 when I was fired and days later got on a plane, got my Irish passport back, and got on a plane to Dublin. Sitting there on Grafton Street in Dublin, which is like the Fifth Avenue, I guess you could say, of Dublin, sitting at this great cafe, I never imagined that I would be, about to enter this nightmare of investigations and indictments and trial and appeal and prison and the Supreme Court and winning in the Supreme Court. I mean, I'm telling you, when I was sitting there at Bewley's Cafe having, soda bread and coffee, that, 3 years later, just a little over 3 years later, I'd be sitting in federal prison having, instant coffee and, stale bread.
That's a big 180
nightmare that I feared. It was a nightmare I couldn't conceive of.
Right.
Sometimes even harder, right? I mean, it's a nightmare you're living.
Right.
And the other day I was doing this great podcast with a great lawyer in New Jersey who said that he talks to a number of his clients about going through the criminal justice process, and he tells them it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And I said, never argue with the podcast host, but it's not a marathon, because a marathon is something that ends.
Right.
I've got 2 great cousins from Ireland who run a lot of marathons, and they know at the end of 26 miles, there's the end. But when you go through a nightmare, when you go through a criminal justice, you don't know when, or quite frankly, if there is going to be an ending. So you just keep going through, and you get up every morning and you just get through the day, and you get up the next morning, you just get through the day. A lot of it goes to our friends, our brothers and sisters in the sobriety movement, who have to do that each and every day. And in no way am I comparing what I went through to the battle that amazing people do every day in the sobriety world. But I learned from them, and I learned directly from them, that one way to get through something very, very hard is just to get through the day. And whether that is the investigation,
Yep.
just get through the investigation phase for me where, I took a job at an amazing law firm in Princeton, New Jersey, hired me after I was fired from the Port Authority, after the world blew up and I was on the front page of every newspaper in the world and on TV day after day. They hired me, and every day I'd take the train to the office and I'd pass the Newark federal courthouse where I knew that the folks of the United States Attorney's Office were investigating me. And so I was there seeing that every day, and it was hard. It was hard to go through that.
Well, I mean, I can't imagine with all that, getting into a situation like that is one thing, but having it as public as it was, there's nowhere to hide. There's nowhere for you to go.
Literally nowhere. And I remember getting up one morning, right when the email came out and the Bridgegate case became a federal investigation. I remember a couple of days later, it was a Saturday morning, and I got up to go to the gym, and I walked over and got a coffee at Starbucks. And the Starbucks used to sell these things called newspapers. They were a thing back then. People would read. And I was there at the front page of the New York Post. There I was, a picture of me and the word cover up. Yeah. And I had my Duke basketball hat on, and I lowered it just a little bit. And I walked over to the gym, got on the elliptical machine, and I looked up on the TVs above the elliptical machine, and there I was. And I remember the person next to me on the elliptical machine sort of looked at me and looked up at the TV and looked back at me. And, it was everywhere. You could not go.
It was there was a big story. So in that world, Bill, how did you begin to survive working in an environment where there was nowhere to hide? You had to fight, you had to battle, but it was something that you would have never have dreamed of.
It's interesting. I had a great piece of advice from my old friend, who's still my friend, Jim McGreevey. He had been governor of New Jersey. We very much did not agree on politics when he was governor on a number of areas, but he was one of the people who reached out to me when Bridgegate really blew up. And he said to me that, because he had gone through his own tribulations when he came out and left the governorship. And I remember he said that times like this are like standing on the beach, or those of us from New Jersey, the shore. And you're standing on the shore, and a wave is about to come in. You see the wave coming, and you can't run away. So you're there on the beach, and the wave is coming, and you have two choices. Choice number one is you fight and you throw your arms around and you get all upset and you try and stop getting wet, or you let the wave hit you and you let it go back out. Either way, you're going to get wet.
Yeah. One
of the two is better for you mentally. And I thought that was a really astute thing to say. And because at the time, 90-something% of the people in my life disappeared. Now, part of that group, they had to, because so many people in my life were either at the Port Authority or in politics or in the governor's office. And a significant number of those people were actual potential witnesses in the investigation. I'm a lawyer. I was a lawyer then. My cast of thousands, some amazing lawyers who represented me, says you can't talk to those people. I'm not talking about those folks. I mean, it's the people who were not witnesses in the case, who were not involved in the case, who disappeared like I had some dread disease, just like that, they disappeared. And everybody that I've talked to in the justice impact community, whether you're in a case as high profile as Bridgegate, or you did something that, in your hometown, and everybody has that experience. It's the 10% that stick. It's the people who run towards you. That's
remember that.
It's a very painful way to find out who your friends are, but there is a gift you get from that, to find out who your friends are who run towards you. I was very fortunate that I have a group of friends here, both in New Jersey and also in New York, especially in the LGBT community, who ran towards me when this was happening, that didn't run away, that didn't see. And I know my closest group of friends, they were all talking to each other, because every night one of them would call and ask me for dinner. Like there was constantly people outreach, and then you'd find strangers, people who had
people you didn't expect.
People at the Starbucks, because remember, it was on the news, it was everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And people would, I remember the day I was convicted. So I was convicted, and the timing of the conviction was right before the 12 o'clock news. So we were live on the 12 o'clock news, and I remember after I was convicted, the judge, of course, gave us bail. We weren't getting locked up, that we weren't getting remanded that day. And
Right.
we're on the train, come back to New York City, get off the train at Penn Station, and walked into like that one of those cafes to get a coffee or something. And this random stranger who I've never met before, I've never seen since, I'm standing there. He looks at me and goes, "You've had a tough day," and bought my coffee.
Wow.
Right. And part of getting through a nightmare is realizing the cliche, you're going to get through it, which is true.
Yeah.
But there's also the other truth is that there's people out there who are going to help you get through it, even if you don't think so.
And people that you don't expect.
Somebody else said to me said, let the people who want to love you, love you. Let the people who want to support you. And sometimes that's hard to remember going through something like this.
And when you were going through the nightmare of this, I know you had to make some difficult decisions too, because you got down to a strange environment where you were appealing your situation, but you were also having to decide, should I go into prison? Because when it finally came in, you had the choice. I've got 18 months to go in, serve. I'm hoping, what do you say? I think you say this in a lot of different things. You've got 1 out of 10,000 chances for this Supreme Court to take you up, and you're a convicted felon that's trying to get this overturned. And it was interesting. You talked about going to Outback with your dad, and you decide, I'm going to do both, because I'm going to go to prison and I'm going to fight this. And you went in, and what was going through your mind, Bill, as a guy that had been on the other side of the world, had done some incredible things in legislature and been on a number of boards and done some politics and your personal life and all those different things. And you're standing before the judge and they say that you've got so many months in prison. What did that feel like? What was that world to you then?
A couple of things. But first of all, there's certain decision-making points when you go through something like this.
Yeah.
And I would say one of the first big points was the opportunity to plead guilty. 98% of federal cases, every criminal case brought by any federal prosecutor, 98% of them end up in a plea.
Yes.
Of the 2% that actually go to trial, 90% of those people are convicted.
Right.
So, it's better
It's a good winning percentage.
Right. Exactly right. The government's not going to lose. And quite frankly, in my case, until the Supreme Court, they didn't. So there's a lot of pressure to plead guilty. And the government, in my case, 3 or 4 times offered a plea deal. Mm-hmm. And the problem is, and the blessing is, that I have a dad who grew up in the South Bronx. And Bill Sr., when I would talk to him about this, it would have broken his heart for me to plead guilty to something I believed was not a crime.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court ended up saying it's not a crime.
Right.
But the pressure is immense just to get it over with.
Immense.
Like, in the middle of the nightmare, let's get it over with. And,
Yep.
There were times, it was very dark times, very hard times, where I just thought, take this cup away from me. Like, let me just plead guilty.
Yeah.
Go in and move to Dublin and work in a pub. Like,
Yep.
Just get this over with.
Be done with it.
Right. But my father, it would have broken his heart. It would have broken his heart. It was better for Bill Sr. for me to go to, I remember him saying, that it was better for me to go to prison and come out than plead to something I didn't do. And of course I would say, my father would say, we don't plead guilty to stuff we didn't do. We don't plead guilty. And I was like, well, we don't go to prison.
Right.
But for him, it was better for me to make that decision not to plead. And the second key decision point was so we get convicted, sentenced.
How long did that process last for you, Bill?
I was convicted in November. Well, I was indicted in May of 15.
Okay.
Convicted in November of 16. So that's a year and a half.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until November of 18. So 2 years later, the Court of Appeals decision came down. So it was 2 years, right? And my appellate lawyer, who was somebody I went to law school with and still a dear friend, Mike Levy, in the trial practice, I was reviewing documents. So there's something that I was involved in, working with my lawyers, Mike Baldessari and Jen Mara, 2 amazing trial lawyers. But in the appeal, there's nothing for me to do.
Right.
So I just sat there for 2 years. When the Court of Appeals decision came down, they threw out half the charges, but they kept half the charges. Right. I had to make another decision, right? And my biggest fear was not my ability to get through federal prison. I'd be fine. A number of people I'd talk to, I'd be fine. But, my biggest worry was what would happen to Dad in June. They
Yeah.
were in their 70s at the time. The last thing I wanted is something happened to them and I'm sitting in prison and couldn't be there to help. I'm one of the two caregivers for them going through.
Right. And that happens a lot.
Yeah, and I just made the decision that day. That I remember it very, very clearly. And by the way, it was not a hard decision. This was not some like rend my garments. What do I do? It was a very quick decision. Let's get this over with. And I remember going to see Mike Levy, my appellate lawyer, and saying, Mike, let's do two things at once. Let's go in, burn the time, get it over with, and let's take the 1 in 10,000 chance that we go to the Supreme Court and win. Let's do both. So I chose to ask, and I remember you were mentioning go down to the Outback Steakhouse in Hamilton, New Jersey, and over grilled salmon and a bloomin' onion, tell Dad in June that I was going to go to prison. And Dad understood that. This was like, let's get this done. Never thinking the Supreme Court would actually take the case. So I made the decision to go into prison with no question, because Dad and June, I had to get out to help them. Now, Bridget Kelly, my co-defendant and friend, had young kids. She had every incentive to stay out as long as possible and hope the Supremes took the case. So we both made the right decision. People say to me now, oh, you must regret going in. Not for a second. Brent, I tell you, when you're making key decisions in life, you can't look back and say, well, if I would have known then, but I didn't know. This was the right decision at the right time for me, for my future, for Dad and June, for getting it over with. And quite frankly, I go in on April 9th, 2019. John Hollab, who he and his wife had been roommates of mine years before, picks me up at 3-something in the morning on a Tuesday morning. I remember the night before, it was a Monday night, had a small going away dinner at a family that we were very close with. Went back.
Such a weird thing, isn't it? When you those hours that tick away before you go into prison.
Exactly right. And I remember going home to the house I grew up in, where my dad still lives. John was going to pick me up the next morning, and Dad and I sat in the living room, and June, we sat in the living room and watched the University of Virginia, where I had gone to law school, win the NCAA national championships for men's basketball. And quite frankly, had Bridgegate or prison or any of that ever happened, there was no chance I was sitting in the living room watching that game with my father. I would have been either at the game or watching it somewhere else. And it was an interesting moment because it humbled me, but it put me in the right place, because that living room that night watching UVA basketball with my dad, probably the only time any school that I went to is going to win the national basketball championship, was the right place to be. And the next morning, John picked me up and we drove the 4 hours to Loretto Federal Prison. And that Tuesday morning at 9:02 in the morning or something, I walked into federal prison, not imagining that the 18-month sentence that I had would end up being shortened to 3 months. And 3 months later, the Supreme Court of the United States took my case. And to the credit of the government, the prosecutors and the judge, I was out of prison 2-something days later. And John Hollab, my friend, drove back across the state to pick me up and drove me home. And
that's incredible.
Yeah, it was amazing.
I want to go in, Bill, and to walk into those gates. Before I do, somebody in a group, the White Collar Support Group, Nightmare Success podcast is sponsored by the White Collar Support Group, the world's first support group devoted to people navigating the white collar criminal justice system. I'm a member of the White Collar Support Group, and I can tell you that there's a bunch of people who help each other through the criminal justice journey for free. Whether you're just starting your journey or you've made it through to the other side, this is a great space for you. You can join us on Zoom Monday, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Pacific. For information, go to prisonus.org. That's prisonus.org. Start here. It's a great organization.
It really,
actually, Bill, that's where
the guest is not supposed to talk about the advertisers, but I have to tell you, the White Collar Support Group and the work that Jeff Grant and you and others have done, hundreds and hundreds. They just had I think their
400th meeting
the other night, and this is an amazing organization of people. Even maybe somewhat, especially people who are done. They're out, they're finished.
Yeah.
The time is done, yet they're still dedicated to this community. And join it, support it, listen to it, participate in it. For people who are going through this process, there is no greater resource out there. So please.
I totally agree with you. I appreciate that shout out, Bill. So walking in to prison, thinking you're going 18 months, What is your world like in an arena that you never thought you would enter? Never imagined that this would be something that you were walking into. What and how do you, what are the strategies you use to enter that world?
I think one of the first and important strategies is to prepare.
Yeah.
Talk to other people, including the white collar support group, but others who have gone through it, maybe gone to the same place. I had the fortune of talking to a couple of different people who had been to Loretto. And so that's the first thing, is to prepare. The second is to humble yourself. Realize that you're no better than anybody else that's in there.
Yeah.
Especially those of us who come out of the political space or the leadership space or the CEO of the widget company or something. You're no better than anybody else. And humbling yourself before you go in is important. I think third, realizing that it's going to be over. You're going to get through it. The worst day is the day before you go in.
I agree.
Right. And of course, every case manager in every federal prison in America says, your first day in is closer to one day out. But in some ways, mentally, I thought in some ways I walked in and goes, there's nothing else they can do to me. The United
Right.
States,
this is the rock bottom.
The
Yeah.
United States government is putting me in federal prison, and darn
Yes.
it, they're not going to beat me. And one of the other tips is put the rocks down.
Yeah.
The anger, betrayal, sadness, hurt, bitterness, and no matter what your case is, and everybody I served in Loretto with and everybody I've spoken to served elsewhere, there's feelings of betrayal or anger or lack of trust, and you have to put that down.
Yeah, bitterness will kill you.
It's like carrying those bricks around the track. It's not worth it.
And Bill, I think the other thing that you said there, which is such a huge thing, and for the inside or the outside, is humbling yourself, because, looking around, seeing who's getting their time right, maybe the way you want to do your time, and asking them how they're getting. I looked around and thought, yeah, there's a guy that's reading books that I like. There's a guy that's doing a workout routine that I should do, or there's a person over here who's got a prison job. How do I get? But humbling yourself and just figuring out, and then asking them how they're getting through it. It's like getting the answers to the test before the test a lot of times. And, it's a very primitive environment. So you're right. Everybody, when you walk in there, you don't walk in with anything but yourself. You walk in as Bill Baroni, Brent Cassity, and you survive. And it's whatever you make of that is how you survive it.
Yeah. And all the cliches that you hear are true. Keep your head down, do your own time.
Yeah.
It's don't do anybody else's time.
Yeah.
And be respectful to people around you.
Yeah.
Understand that all of us have different journeys that we got there. It's actually one of the reasons I helped start the Prison Visitation Fund, along with my colleague and friend Gordon Kaplan, who himself went into Loretto, different time than me. But, when I was there at Loretto, I had the good fortune of having family visits. Story I'll tell you in a second, but a lot of people didn't have the, family just couldn't afford to come visit. There was
it's expensive.
My friend, Brother Palmer from Baltimore, not that many hours away from Loretto. His family for years could not afford to come visit him in prison, yet we expect people to get out of prison and return to their lives, right? So we started the Prison Visitation Fund to raise money to help people to afford to be able to go visit their family members. Now, for me, visits were, I think for everybody, visits are a big deal.
Huge.
I remember I was there in prison about a week and a half, and I was doing fine. I had done all the things I just said. I prepared for it. I talked to people. I kept my head down. I did my own time. And I was there about a week and a half, and I was sleeping fine. The first night I was in Loretto, I slept fine. I knew this was going to be over with. I was going to do these 18 months or so and get home. So I was there about a week and a half, and Dad and June were going to be my first visitors. And the Friday night before, they drove across from Hamilton, New Jersey to Loretto. They stayed the Friday night at the Courtyard by Marriott in Altoona, Pennsylvania. I talked to Dad, as I did every night, the night before. And I said, look, Pop, visiting is 8:30 to 2:30. Get here about 8 o'clock, 8:15. Go through security. This way we can visit for 6 hours. I said, but at 9:30, they shut everything down. So I'm either with you and get counted in the room, or I got to go back to my bunk and you sit in the parking lot. Oh, no, my father, former military guy. No, we'll be on time. Don't worry about it. We're going to be there. No, fine. So I get up. I put my green uniform, my boots on, getting ready for the visit. It's now 8:30. They start calling guys into the visiting room. and I'm not called. Bear, report to the visiting room. Finger Hut, report to the visiting room. Park, report to the visiting room. No Baroni. It's now 8:45, and my father is so prompt. He's always on time. It's like, and all of those very worries that drove me
real worries. Yeah.
Like there'd be an accident, somebody got sick, they're in the hospital, they got lost. All those things that caused me to go into prison, all of a sudden, I've had no anxiety the entire first week and a half in prison. That moment, unbelievable anxiety.
Yeah.
That something had happened. 9 o'clock, no dad. 9:15, no dad. I'm like, there's really an issue. 9:30, they call count. And for any of your many listeners who've never been to prison, that's the moment they call you got to go back to your bunk on a Saturday.
It's a big deal. Yeah.
Right? Big deal. So I'm like, oh my God, my father's, this is terrible. I am in full panic. And I'm walking back to my bunk for count. And I walk past the phones and I pick the phone up and call my father's cell phone, hoping he would answer he answers the phone. It's like, hey, Bill. It's like, hey, Pop, where are you? He's like, we're in the parking lot. I said, what are you doing in the parking lot? He said, well, when we got here, we drove over and we got here and they had just shut everything down for count. I said, yeah, Pop, I understand that. I thought you guys were getting here about 8 o'clock. He said, oh yeah, well, when we came downstairs at the hotel this morning to come visit, they have a breakfast buffet. And my father said what every 70-something-year-old man of his generation would say is that, well, it came with the room.
Yeah.
I said, and then he said, and this is, my God love him. He said, well, and we knew you weren't going anywhere.
I so identify with that whole story. And Bill, I had read that story because you had talked about it at another interview. And you're talking about people not getting visits. And for me, I was one of the very lucky ones. I had a wife that came every weekend, and then I had some kids that were all along the way at the University of Missouri. So she'd pick up whoever was up. But there was always that worry because it was a 4.5-hour drive.
Yeah.
And there was also 2 times where there was a particular CO that was the visiting cop. And if the room got half full, that she just said she was shutting it down. So I had 2 times when my wife and kids showed up, 4.5-hour drive, and she just turned them away. So there's a lot of things that you deal with anxiety wise that you don't have any control over, and you have to eat it. I mean, it's like, you get emasculated to the point where there was nothing I could do about that. There was nothing I could act out or do or solve. And I think that's another thing that you go through is, you have to live within yourself, knowing what you can control. And it's very tough because for those who have had control, you go into an environment like that and somebody does that to your family. You're like, my gosh, I want to do a lot of something here. But those moments are different.
You raise a terrific point about control. People who have been CEOs or politicians. I mean, one day I'm, rebuilding the World Trade Center, and the next day I'm sitting in federal prison. You've lost all control. You have to accept that on the way in, that you do not. And it's the people who, again, think of standing on the shore when the wave is coming in. You have no control over the wave. Mm-hmm. Don't try and fight it. You don't have control. And in some ways, it's part of the reset. Right.
It is.
You don't have your phone and you're going through your phone every 2 seconds. You're not looking at the email. You don't have control. Focus on the things when you're there that you can control. Getting in better shape physically, getting in better shape emotionally, getting in better shape intellectually. Read every book you can.
Yes.
Getting in better shape spiritually, whatever your faith tradition or no faith tradition is. Enhance that. You can control that, right?
Those are things you can
Bible
control.
Study. You can go to Ramadan services. You can go to shul. You can read a book you have. You can take a class. I mean, I was taking classes. By the way, true story, Brent. So I'm there. It's my first weekend. Now I was a little bit higher profile when I got there because of my case. So some people knew, and then of course everybody knew, right, about Bridgegate. So actually, I got a nickname very quickly soon thereafter, that my nickname in prison, and I was told this is an honor to be given a nickname so quickly.
Sure.
My nickname in prison was Billy Bridgegate. So imagine
Bridgegate. I like that.
being a bank robber and everybody walking around going, hey, it's Billy Bank Robber, right? So it's like, great. So the cops the corrections officer called me Bridgegate. So anyway, so I'm there a couple of days. Everybody knew I was there. I go to, because I took all the adult continuing education classes I could, because I filled time and why not? And one of them was like the great architectural works of the world. And it was this like PBS or Learning Channel or Discovery Channel, something like series. And, week 16, week 17, week 18. And we were on the next week and they put the video on. I'm sitting there in the back of the room there on a Saturday night, late Saturday afternoon. And this week's great architectural is the George Washington Bridge. And the whole room just turned around and looked at me. And I used an epithet that I will not use on your podcast about what was that all about. I was like, and you have to laugh, right?
You have to.
That was a great example of a moment of humility, right? Like I could get all up in it. Wow, you guys are doing this on purpose. Or just, you got to be, there's a great old
You
Irish.
got to roll with it. I had a similar situation, Bill, where, my dad and me and 4 other people went to prison, and it was a pretty big, deal. And I got a letter from CNBC that they were going to do an episode of American Greed. And I thought it was just one of those things that they send these letters out and they would never do it. I got an email from my brother that said, no, they're doing this. So I was with 435 guys. I didn't know what I was going to do because I've never seen an American Greed episode where it ends up good. I mean, it's always even the voice, from the person who does it.
Yeah.
I thought, I'm just going to have to sit here and take this. I don't know what's going to happen in this hour with these 435 guys and all the guards watching it. And I sat there not knowing, and I survived it. And, so it's amazing what you can adapt to. It's amazing what you can walk through. And, when you were talking about the night before, nothing is as bad as your mind makes it out to be, not even prison. And, starting to step through that is part of the, but I want to get to the point where you're working through all this. You're going through your prison world. But in the rest of your world, you've got the Supreme Court of the United States that takes up your case. I mean, what are you thinking?
Well, so we'd appeal to the Supreme Court, as did Bridget. I'm in prison, and honestly, I was doing fine. I was working out 5 hours a day. I was teaching GED. I was, I have a very.
Had you written the book before you went to prison about the Fat Kid Gets Fit?
Oh yeah, Fat Kid Got Fit. I published about 9 years before I went into prison. Tens of people had read the book, and so I worked out every day, and I was fine. I just didn't expect them to take the case. And the way the Supreme Court worked, which I knew before I went in, is like they will, when they consider whether to take your case or not, they publish the list of the cases they're considering, right? Yeah. And they never, the expectation was they consider it and then they say no, they turn us down. And they considered it and didn't say anything. They considered it again and didn't say anything. It was sort of like, well, I remember this is June of that year. I went in April, this is June. And it started to be like, well, maybe we got a shot. Yeah. And then I convinced myself that what happened was they decided not to take the case. But one of the justices wanted to write a dissent from that, wanted to say we should have. And then it got to be the last day of the term. It was a Friday. It was the last day of the term. We knew that was going to be the day they were going to turn us down or accept the case. And I remember I stuck to my routine that day, and I did my workout group with my morning workout group. I did my walk with my dear friend June Park, as we did every day. Of course, we don't have the internet in prison, as you know. So I had talked to my friend Sue Ferrara, who's a former journalist and professor and as member of the school board in my hometown of Hamilton, very supportive of me, very supportive of Dad and June. And I emailed with her the night before and said, look, the court's going to put this list out exactly at 9:30. Can I call you at 9:40 and you can tell me the case got turned down? Yeah. And she said, sure. Did my walk, cut it off a little bit early, 9:40, walk over to the phone area, and my friend Cephas, who was a guy I worked out with every morning, a big guy from Philadelphia, wonderful. He was the shot caller. Yeah. Very good to me. And he's at the other phone. And I call Sue up at 9:40 and she's like upset on the phone. I was like, Sue, it's okay. Don't worry about it. She said, no, they took the case. I said, no, Sue, they didn't take the case. She said, no, they did. I was like, no, they didn't. I said, Sue, why don't you read me exactly what it says? And sure enough, they took the case. And I start, oh my God. And Cephas looks down on me, this big, he looks down at me and goes, are you all right? And it was like, then the world changed. I was like, I knew just my legal experience that if they took the case, we were going to win. Yes. And and the government within hours agreed to bail. So I knew I was getting out, but it was a weekend and they had to get the motion right. And Mike, my appellate lawyer, was flying back from Asia, we're clients. So he's doing all this on the plane right? And so I ended up getting out Monday, but interestingly enough, Saturday, so the next day, and I told Sue, I said, would you please call my dad? Because I can't make another phone call for 45 minutes.
Right.
So Dad and June were already on the way to Loretto with another family, the Lou and Dar DeMarco. Lou is sad, very sadly passed away. But the four of them were driving over for a regular visit. They was just coming to visit with me.
Just to visit you.
Right. It was a very different visit. It was a joyful visit. Because the government, I was getting out, whether it was going to be Sunday or it was going to be Monday.
Whatever.
I was getting out. And we sat there, and I have this great picture of the five of us at a picnic table outside the camp, outside at the camp. And I was going home, and there's a smile on all five of our faces. Of course, that's the same conversation where my father looks at me and he says, the only downside of you getting out early is that we didn't get a chance to visit the 9/11 memorial in Somerset, Pennsylvania, which is just a couple miles away. And I looked at my father. I was like, "Would you like me to stay?" I mean, I could.
He could go make his visit.
I could call Judge Wigginton and say, "Just kidding. Can you leave me here for a while?" Call Chief Justice Roberts and say, "You know what? Never mind. I'm going to stay."
We got a visit. We got to take care of.
My father wants to go to the gift shop at the 9/11 museum. So anyway,
that's funny. So you get this. They release you. Yeah. Now you're back into the world. What's going on in your mind?
Usually when people get out of prison, they know when they're getting out.
Sure. This is different. That's why I'm curious, like, what in the world was going on in your head?
The worst nights of sleep that I had in prison were those last couple of nights, because I didn't know when I was going home, because, and of course, July 4th was coming up and the guards are going to leave, and would I be stuck there, and shouldn't I be out of here? And so Monday morning,
and it was you got released kind of when all the pandemic stuff was going on.
No,
right?
I was ahead, but no, I was out in June of 19.
Oh, June of 19. Okay. So, the pandemic was a whole nother year around.
Yeah, but
I was going to say it was going to be really weird for you to get out and there was a pandemic.
Well, it's right. So I wake up Monday morning, and I knew they'd been working all weekend. They worked overnight with the government to get the right type of motion. Mm-hmm. I knew they had filed with Judge Wigginton that first thing that morning. Then I knew by about 10 o'clock she had signed the order releasing me. This is my trial judge. Credit to her. Mm-hmm. And then we waited, because the document had to get to Grand Prairie. That Mike.
Everything in the federal prison world goes to Grand Prairie.
And Mike spoke to the warden at Loretto,
Grand Prairie, Texas.
And the warden said, "We'd release him now, but I need an order from Grand Prairie." Grand Prairie said, "We need an original." So Sidley sent an associate to, it was this whole crazy thing. So now it's Monday, and we knew we were getting closer. I knew that John had driven across and sitting at a diner in Altoona, waiting, right? And I'm out, and now the anxiety is high. I know, we're ready to go, right? But I didn't know when I was getting out. I didn't have any clothes. I'm walking the track. I'm listening to music, walking the track. There's this great Irish singer named Christy Moore who's got this great song, Lisdon Varna, about mom's home county in the west of Ireland. And I'm listening to this music, and I'm just trying to, and I see at the top of the hill, Officer Sheehan, who was an officer, pointing at me. And I take the Irish music out of my ears, and, Bridgegate, come here. And I go run up the hill, and he's like, "Okay, get your stuff. You're out of here." That was it, right? So I went and got my stuff, and you remember this. When something good happens on the compound, it's hope for everybody.
Everybody feels that sense of hope that something can happen.
So the whole place is this sort of excitement, and we had lunch, and people were coming up. It was really, really great. So I got all my stuff, and I got called into the officers in the camp, the little office there. And they said, "Okay, put your stuff over there. We're just waiting they're finishing your paperwork in the main building, and just go wait for a little bit." So now I'm in the TV room, and guys are coming up to me, "Congratulations, don't forget us." I said, "I'd never forget," which I didn't. Mm-hmm. And up on the TV was CNN or one of them. And it was me, and the thing on the screen says, "Bridgegate figure released." And I'm like, "Nope, still here."
Not yet.
Still here, not quite yet. But again, so they then eventually call me over, and I'm in it's the middle of, so I'm in prison sweats and a t-shirt. I didn't have any clothes to leave with, right? John didn't have time to pick anything up because we didn't know when I was getting out. And I remember getting in the car after and I'll tell you a story. but get in the car with John, and we're pulling out of the parking lot a year early. And I called Dad, and I called Bridget, and I called Mike Levy. And then I rolled the window down and just
took it in.
And it was really overwhelming. That's sort of when it hit. But to go back to a little story I want to tell you, and I know our time is coming up, but as I'm checking out, and I said goodbye to everybody, and I'm standing in the lobby of the main building that I had been in 3 months before when I pushed that button and went in, knowing we were going to win, knowing I was not coming back, or believing I was not coming back. And the lieutenant comes with my file and all this. And he gives me, I sign this and sign that. And I said to him, I just need my driver's license back. And he goes through the file. He said, we don't have it. So, okay. He said, you can stay here. We can go look for it. I said, no, that's okay. I'll leave. So I get in the car. I don't have a driver's license. And get in the car. Remember, I wake up in my bunk in prison, not knowing I'm getting out. Now I'm out. Go home to Hamilton and come back to the city because I didn't have a driver's license.
Right.
And I had all my I literally woke up in my bunk and went to bed in my apartment.
That's so crazy.
And my super in my apartment had brought my stuff up from storage. So I got all these boxes. I'm looking through, it's like 1 a.m. I'm looking through for like anything. And I needed to get a driver's license. But I didn't have anything. Yeah. So the next day went back down to Hamilton. Dad and June picked me up and we drove over to the DMV to get a replacement license. But all I had, I couldn't find my birth certificate. I couldn't find my social security card. All I had was an expired driver's license and an expired passport with a hole in it. And I get the little form and I get up in line number 9. I'll never forget it. Brent, it's like it happened yesterday. Get in line number 9, crazy DMV, all this stuff. And I get up to the counter and there's a woman behind the counter who's probably been doing car registrations and driver's licenses since Henry Ford was making them. And she doesn't look up. And I hand her the form and the expired driver's license, the expired passport. She doesn't even look up. She says, I can't accept these. And she looks up because I don't know what to say. She looks up and she looks at me. And we both look down on her desk and a copy of the Trentonian, which is a newspaper in my home area. And I'm on the front page.
Right.
And she sort of smiles and she says to me, she nods her head and she says, do you have a credit card? I said, yeah. I give her a credit card. She starts typing and she says, I'm from Hamilton. I said, oh, great. Me too. And she said, I always voted for you. She said, I know you from St. Gregory's Church. You never came to my door, but I know you from church. I said, oh, thank you. She said, everybody around here knows what happened. And I'm so happy for you. And you're going to win and you got to be strong. And we believe in you. People around here know you.
Awesome.
I'm starting now all this sort of like days, months of emotion starting to boil up.
Yeah.
And she gives me the new driver's license and she grabs my hands and she says, be strong, stay strong. And then she says, can I come give you a hug? I've never met this woman. 90% of the people in my life disappeared.
Yeah.
This woman who I've never met gets up in the middle of DMV, walks out to the main floor upstairs, and she gives this little lady, she gives me this big hug. She says, be strong. You're going to be okay. At this point, I'm doing everything I can not to break down in tears. Now, admittedly, I would not be the first person to cry at DMV, but for different reasons. And
well, this is a big shout out for DMV.
Right. And so she gives me a hug, and Dad and June are sitting in like the waiting area. So they don't know what this is all about. And I just go walking out because I'm going to break down. I go walking out to the parking lot to the car. And then I lose it. Honestly, it
all hits you.
It all hits me in the parking lot of the Motor Vehicle Commission in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. A wonderful group of employees who did not intend to make me cry.
Yeah. And
they come outside in June. My stepmom, who's just wonderful, she says, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" I was like, "Yeah, stay strong." She remembers me. My father's like, "Get in the car. We got to go." Right. And it told me, and I think it should tell everybody who's going through this. And by the way, it's not just going through as a justice impacted person. Yeah. It's going through somebody who's had a string of bad luck and losing jobs. It's someone going through real health challenges.
Everybody has prisons in their own mind.
It's someone going through loss.
Yes.
that there really are people out there,
Mm-hmm.
good people who are there.
Yeah.
And the challenge is not just to recognize that wonderful woman behind the counter at DMV who you don't know, who gives grace to you and says you're going to be okay. It's to become the woman behind the counter who gives the grace, right? And if anything, I talked about when you go into prison being humbled, is when you get out of prison, when you get over the sickness, when you get through the loss, or when you get the new job, whatever your prison is to recognize the good things that people did for me and continue to do it for other people. And that's why your podcast is so important. That's why Jeff Grant's group is so important. That's why Prison Visitation Fund is so important. That's why the work Gordon Kaplan does is so important, is not forgetting what we got out of it, because we got so much taken away from us, including freedom, including liberty. And whether that freedom was going to prison, or whether that freedom is you're sitting in a cancer ward getting chemo, or whether that freedom is sitting at a funeral for a loved one, or whether that freedom is not having a job, right? Whatever freedom gets taken away, when you get it back, right? Using that experience, using that pain, that hardship, that difficulty, be the 10%. Be the people that runs to someone who just, your neighbor gets cancer, go help them. Your neighbor's going to prison, go help them. Take what you've suffered,
give back
the nightmare you've had, and make somebody else's nightmare just a little bit less bad.
That's so good, Bill. I mean, that's and so important. And I think that's why you're such a good, powerful voice to this space, because you've lived both sides. Let's talk about what you're doing now.
Yep. Well, as you mentioned before at the opening, I'm teaching law at the Seton Hall University Law School.
Which I think is awesome.
Law at Seton Hall, which is an amazing law school.
Yeah.
I taught law starting back in 2002.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the great interregnum of Bridgegate, and they were very kind and allowed me to come back. I wrote a course for them on prison law, because when I was in law school, criminal practice law was basically cops and robbers was the first semester of, investigations and subpoenas and warrants. And the second semester was bail to jail, the trial practice witnesses. But there's so much, as you and I both have lived, so much when it comes to from jail to home.
Exactly.
So that's the course that I wrote.
I love that.
And teach. And I'm so lucky to have an incredible group of students. I guess I teach it in the fall semester. I teach education law in the spring right now as we record this. But in the fall, I teach prison law. And I have about 70 students. And these are people that are going to be future lawyers, judges, clerks, prosecutors, advocates, and the bipartisan growth of focus on criminal justice reform and the rights of inmates, and not just when people are in prison, but getting out of prison and then coming back into the community. I have the opportunity. Seton Hall is a university, one of the few in the country that are teaching this, and really reaching out. There's other schools like Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles that has a similar course, really dedicated to bringing this, because that's how you start to help people who are incarcerated.
Absolutely. I was just thinking, I would love to see that taught everywhere, because that needs to be a part of the curriculum.
It really should be. And it really, you cannot understand the criminal justice program unless you have the third part of that story. Criminal justice law doesn't stop when Bill shows up at Loretto. It stops at the end when everything is done. And that's why that class, and like I tell you, the students that I teach, incredible students, smart, committed. They want it. I mean, this is not a mandatory course. It's an elective. But people want to be involved. And one of the things I tell my students who are far smarter than me, quite frankly, these are folks who are going to be prosecutors. I want future U.S. attorneys to understand the prison process. I want future politicians to understand. Look, I was a moderate Judiciary Committee member in the state legislature, and I wish I knew then what I know now about the process. And people who I know some of my students are future legislators and future judges and future U.S. senators. And I want them to.
And Bill, I got to tell you that the way that I found you was Jeff Grant did a panel with the American Bar Association, and you were on that panel. And I thought, man, I want to talk to him. You can just feel your authenticity and the passion that you have about, and I think that's probably been in your DNA throughout, but now you have this third rail that you know, and you're using it, and it's powerful, because these are the things that make a difference. These are the things that can actually make things move. I want to ask you, because it's been quite a journey with you, Bill. What do you think is your biggest takeaway through this whole journey you've been on?
I think that, be true to yourself.
Yeah.
And for me, that meant my family, Dad and June. It meant my friends, it's the most amazing people that I know. I mean, one of my, it's John. It's people like, I always say, if you don't have a John Holub in your life, go get one. If you don't have an Andrew Hawthorne in your life, go get one. One of my closest friends who became my prison chief of staff and took care of things when I was away. And, people like that, have those people in your life. Be true to yourself, because in the end,
know who the real people are.
In the end, I've been very lucky. I've had lots of great titles: assemblyman, professor, senator, the Port Authority, World Trade.
Quite a Wikipedia page.
Yeah, thanks. But 67325-050.
38224.
Yeah, you never forget it, right? And it's part of the story. And the question is, what do you do with it? Do you forget that? Do you try and forget that chapter of your life? Or do you do what you're doing, what Jeff's doing, what Gordon is doing, what I'm doing, what my friend Dorian Bess is doing, that's out there helping people live through this? Because you're going to survive it. Right. 99 or whatever it is % are going to come home to your community. You're going to come home to your neighborhood. Yep. 1/3 of every person in this country, either themselves or their family member or close friend, has been involved.
It's 100 million people.
This is not some small group.
No.
And so I think that's a big takeaway. And another big takeaway, we talked about this before, is being willing to humble yourself. That, just because you had some great title, just because you did some great things, there are difficult times ahead. And I guarantee every person listening to this either has been, or will be go through a nightmare. We all have them. And the question is not, will you have a nightmare? It's how do you get through it? How do you wake up from that nightmare? And one of the things and we just talked about this, one of the best ways to wake up from a nightmare is have somebody wake you up and be that person who helps somebody wake up from a nightmare. And that's why this podcast is so important.
Powerful.
And I'm glad we were able to talk through it.
Me too, Bill. I mean, your story is, I've been looking forward to this interview because I've just been fascinated with how you've gone through it, what you've done with it, and how you're continuing to help people. And it's a great thing. If people want to get a hold of you, Bill, what would be the best way to do that?
Just email me, billbaroni@gmail.com.
Okay. And you do have that book that you said tens and tens of people.
Tens of people. You can go on Amazon and you can get a copy of Fat Kid Got Fit. And you may be.
You're very fit, by the way, so it worked.
Thank you. Well, yeah, but listen, you work out 5 hours a day and do burpees. You want to talk about nightmare? I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about doing burpees at Loretto.
Oh man, burpees, that is a prison thing, man.
Back during the Supreme Court window, before the court ruled unanimously in our favor. Were you afraid about going back to prison? I said, no, I'm afraid of going back to burpees.
The burpees.
If the listeners don't know what a burpee is, good. That means you didn't go to prison.
It means you didn't go to prison and you can't do any of them. That's right. And if you want another book, I've got one, Nightmare Success. Everybody follow, subscribe, like, if you got anything out of this, and I know you did. And I want to give a shout out to Homestead Financial for my podcast room here. They're wonderful people. If you got home mortgage needs, Greg Aftiev is your guy. Reviews on Apple, those are great. They put the show on Spotify. If you got time, do it. BrentCassity.com. I spell it wrong. It's TY, not DY. And as I used to say when I was writing my emails back and forth from prison, stay strong. I'll do the same. Bill Baroni, thank you. Appreciate it, man. All right.